Hi there, students. In this video, I'm going to attempt to talk about Burke, Mill, and Kant. So as I mentioned in the other video about types of democracies, you can have a direct democracy, or you can have a representative democracy, and you can have a liberal democracy or an illiberal democracy. So we're going to focus here on representative democracies and liberal democracies with Burke, Mill, and Kant. There's a lot to read here, but it kind of all boils down to a few key components. And those are the few key components that I want to focus on. And I think a good place to start is with Immanuel Kant, because Kant, in many ways, comes first. And so, in terms of like priority for us to really think about here. So, for Kant, in this work called Perpetual Peace, which is a heck of a slog to get through, there aren't very many good translations of German out there. This is written in German. It's translated in English, and most translations from German to English aren't very good. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is Kant could have really used an editor to really get his prose down. He is not an easy read. Some of my native German-speaking colleagues actually joke that German speakers learn to read English so they can read Immanuel Kant, because English translators try to edit down his work, right? Make it more legible. But in Perpetual Peace here, Kant is trying to think about how we can attain world peace and how we can make a lasting peace that's durable. And for Kant, he argues that true peace amongst nations of the world is only possible when countries organize themselves according to principles of republican government, right? And that they ought to have representative democracies, and they ought to respect the rights of their citizens and foreigners and all peoples that live within the boundaries of their state. Okay? And he believes that republican forms of government, so representative democracies, will do these things. Right? That states that are organized as representative democracies will be better at protecting the rights of citizens that live within their boundaries, as opposed to states that are not representative democracies. And this time we're thinking of authoritarian governments, not so much direct democracy. No one really this time considers direct democracy as a practical mode of governance. You can have a representative democracy, or you can have a dictatorship, an authoritarian, non-democratic regime. And so for Kant, representative governments are important because representative governments will protect rights of citizens. And that's the way we can ensure peace, because if internally countries are secure and peaceful and calm, which most democracies tend to be, Kant assumes, we will also have world peace. This is where we get the idea of democratic peace theory for all you comparative politics, international politics peoples. The idea that democracies will not go to war with one another, that they will find alternative means to resolve their differences. That comes from Immanuel Kant here in Perpetual Peace. That states that are democracies will hash out their differences because they respect the rights of their citizens and don't want to send their citizens off to war, and states will work collaboratively and cooperatively if they're democracies, right? Representative governments. We also get here in Kant this idea of cosmopolitanism, right? These ideas that there are universal values and beliefs that cut across boundaries, right? That all countries are capable and all citizens are capable of exercising democratic values and protecting the rights of their fellow citizens, and that countries have an obligation to do so. And so, when we think about, efforts of countries to protect rights of citizens of other countries, right? That's when we think about cosmopolitanism, this idea that, citizens across the world have certain universal rights and that there are universal shared values that can cross borders and boundaries, and that countries have an obligation to respect those. That's what we call cosmopolitanism. And Kant thinks that as more countries become democracies, we will create leagues of democracies, right? Where Republican organizations that will, Republicans as in Democratic, represent democracy organizations, not like GOP party. That, sort of league of republics, these democratic countries will join together to try and secure peace and prosperity and export democracy and human rights around the world. Okay? So that's Kant. So Kant believes that Republican government will produce peace and security. I want to take a look here at Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is a member of Parliament in the United Kingdom, writing around the times of the French Revolution. So before and after the French Revolution is his time. He's quite opposed to direct democracy because he sees it as an excess of liberty will destroy rights and freedoms. In this speech to the electors of Bristol, we get a plea for representative democracy, but a certain type of representative democracy, right? What's known to all you American government students as a trustee model of representation, where representatives are not to simply carry out the will of their constituents, but are tasked with doing what they believe is right for the broader community, beyond just their constituents. So, Burke is skeptical in many ways of democracy as a functioning form of government. He believes that government exists for the good of the whole community and must represent the interests of all peoples. And so his idea of representation is not radically democratic. Because for him, the job of members of parliament, the jobs of representatives, is not to carry out the wishes of the constituents. Right? The idea is to express a clear conviction of the judgments and conscience, Burke says, of the member of parliament. Right? They are supposed to weigh within their conscience and use their judgment to decide what they think is the best decision for the national whole, right? That members of parliament, that elected officials need to use enlightened judgment to decide the best course of action, because the public can be wrong, right? And Burke, is very much influenced by what he sees as the excesses of liberty and democracy happening in revolutionary France. He's very much concerned about an abundance of liberty and freedom and an abundance of democracy leading to violence and tyranny. And so, there's real concern for Burke that democracies ought not just to give into the passions of the people, but democratic governments, representative democracy, ought to take the passions of the people and try to channel those into some enlightened means of something that's universally acceptable to and good for the entire community, right? So a representative that is simply saying, well, my constituents want this, hence I will do it, is not doing justice to a representative democracy, Burke thinks, because that's how we can end up with really unenlightened and uninformed legislation. Because sometimes the passions of the people are illiberal. Right? Sometimes the passions of the people are scary and wrong and undemocratic, grossly undemocratic, right? Wanting to oppress certain peoples. And it's up to representatives to channel those passions through discussion and deliberation in a legislature, to hear the people out, but ultimately decide what is best for the whole community and not just representatives. Finally, we have John Stuart Mill, who in his work on his theories on representative government has three key principles that he wants to discuss. One is the principle of political participation. The second is a principle of competence. And the third is his overall theory of government. Okay? And so in this, this work on representative government, Mill wants to discuss the best form of democracy, the best type of constitution possible. And his aim is to describe how participation and competence impact representative democracy, right? Mill's thinking, when you read Mill, there's lots of contradictions, and it's full of tensions, because Mill is not, he's a bit of a sloppy writer, okay? But that's okay. So the first place we want to start is with this idea of participation, right? So participation is important. And that Mill says the only government which can fully satisfy all the exigencies of the social state is one in which the whole people participate, and that any participation, even in the smallest public function, is useful, right? So participation is important. Citizens need to participate, okay? Mill does not dismiss participatory democracy, right? He resists direct democracy, but in a representative system, the best way to ensure that representatives are taking into account the considerations of the people is for as many people to participate as possible, right? As people participate, Mill thinks, the more people who participate, the better idea that representatives will have of what their constituents want and what's good for the community as a whole. Right? If very few people participate, we don't have a good idea of what the public thinks. Also, the more people participate and the more often they do it, the more practice they get at participation. And that practice is useful because it creates better citizens. We can see here channeling Aristotle. Okay? The second component, there's competence, right? And that democracy should give as much weight as possible to people of superior intellect and virtue. Right? So we don't want the rabble, right? The common man making all the decisions. We want to give more weight to people that have expertise. Hence, representative government. Representative government can do that. Ideally, Mill thinks participation and increased participation will increase competence of citizens, but that's not always possible, right? And so what we really need are features like representative government to sustain democratic participation. Not all citizens are equally and highly competent. And so, we've got a conflict here, right? There's a tension between lots of people participating and competence, but Mill thinks they can go together. And if, participation becomes more extensive, people might be able to become more competent. But also, if more people participate, that drowns out the extremely intelligent few that Mill thinks ought to be given additional weight, right? But on the other hand, if we give too much weight to the extremely intelligent few, then we're not putting enough emphasis on participation. So he wants us to find some middle ground between those two, between drowning out the voices of the people who we ought to be heard because they know a little bit more than others, but also we don't want to have those few people dominate government. Right? We're not looking for democracy. We're not looking for an oligarchy. And so if we go back to Plato, Mill draws from Plato a little bit here, where he says, government requires special skill and competence. Right? We want people, the best people to govern, right? So our representatives should be the best. That's what we want, right? That's the overall theory of government, that we have the most competent people to govern, right? Just like Plato. So that's sort of those three thinkers in a nutshell. Please make sure to read all the readings and do your discussion board comments.